With Inside Out 2 just releasing, and anxiety being a prevalent part of that movie, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about my favorite example of anxiety in a movie. Punch Drunk Love by Paul Thomas Anderson is a film about this guy named Barry, played by Adam Sandler, and what I consider to be his best role to date. Barry is a very awkward and anxious guy in almost every scene in the movie, and the film displays this anxiety in the most perfect way. So we get to the start of the film, and there's instantly a car crash, which is a very clever way of saying that love is about to just crash into his life out of nowhere. And then a piano gets dropped off right in front of him. And the piano is actually a really interesting kind of allegory of his heart, and you'll see how that plays into the film throughout. So after all this very abruptly happens, we're introduced to the main love interest, and her name is Lena. In their first interaction, she's talking to Barry, and instantly he's already super anxious. He literally says, "I don't know," like 3 times at the start of the conversation when she's trying to ask him questions. But during this conversation, I noticed something really interesting where she actually mentions the piano, and she's just like, "Oh, there's the piano in the street over there." And I kind of noticed that it's almost like the classic saying, "Love is in the air." Like the piano just appears out of nowhere. Just a very interesting, subtle thing I noticed that happens at the start of the movie. After their conversation, she leaves, and he literally goes around the corner and hides for a second, which is more so a physical representation of the anxiety in him. And after she leaves, he ends up taking the piano inside with him. He also starts to play some keys on it, and that kind of represents the beating heart. After this, Barry's in his office working, and he starts getting all these phone calls from his 7 sisters, and they keep asking, "Are you going to be at this party? Are you going to be at this party?" Like, just back-to-back phone calls. And during one of the phone calls, he even says, "Sorry, I can't chat right now." And just saying the word chat makes his sister just start flaming him. And she's like, "Oh, you use the word chat? That's a stupid word, and you're a stupid idiot." Which, even at this point, you start to realize that Barry is this very unreliable narrator within the film. And it almost seems like all the things going on around him are actually happening in his head, and he kind of makes them appear in real life. It seems like anything that he could be anxious about is going to go wrong in the future for him. Anytime he talks to one of his sisters in the film, he pretty much gets the worst response possible, and the one he wants to hear the least out of every conversation with them. And I feel like for people with anxiety, this all plays out in the mind of someone with anxiety like that. Even the other day, I was sending someone a message on my phone, and I typed out the message, and I stood there for about a minute just thinking, should I send this? Like, what could possibly go wrong if I do send out this message? A message that did not even matter. And this film is kind of like if, say, me sending that message, I would get the worst response possible out of that. And that's how the anxiety is displayed within the movie. So after all the phone calls and talk about the party, he does end up going, and he brings in a small cake with him. And even before he actually walks into the party, he's about to open the door, and they're already all talking about him. They're making fun of him and telling stories about how embarrassing, like, some sort of situation in his life was. Calling him names and all sorts of stuff like that. And again, it's more so like an exaggerated display of anxiety, because anxiety a lot of the time is purely within the mind, and it's almost all in your head most of the time. It doesn't actually happen in real life. Like, I go to the gym, public gym every day, and I'm a somewhat anxious person, And I've definitely had the thought of, oh, everyone is staring at me while I'm doing this, when I started going to the gym at least. And in this scene at the party, again, it's literally the embodiment of that thought actually happening in the movie, in real life. So he walks in and hands his sister the cake, and instantly she's like, oh, we already have a cake. Again, worst case scenario happens for him. And then instantly after that, he walks up to another guy, and he misspeaks and says food instead of good, and instantly his sister is on his ass about it, and just mentions it, and she's like, oh, you misspoke, you're so dumb, blah blah blah. So we get off to a horrible start at this party, and he is in clear distress already at this point in the scene. And so in one of my favorite shots in the scene, he walks over to these glass doors, and he literally just explodes and breaks them all. And this is what tends to happen with not even just anxious people, but people who just try to hold in all their emotions. You can definitely do it for an amount of time, but everyone needs that release of emotion. When everything gets pent up like that, it just eventually builds up and you explode. And this is exactly what happens with Barry in the scene. And instantly after he destroys all the glass, it's almost in a comical scene where everyone is absolutely hating on him. Again, calling him dumb and calling him other names like that, and just absolutely bullying him. And after this, he goes into another room, and all he can do is cry. It's a very sad scene, but it's also very realistic and very relatable. A couple of scenes later, we get back to Barry's apartment, and he is trying to call this phone sex line. He doesn't necessarily have any weird intentions in this. He literally does it because he's just so lonely. It gets to the point that when he's talking to the girl on the line, he pretty much denies everything sexual that she tries to bring up. He literally just wants to talk to her, which I think a lot of people could also relate to, with just being so alone that you don't care who it is, you just need to talk to someone. Also, before this conversation happens, he gets insanely anxious about it being confidential. He already feels so much embarrassment in his life that it almost feels like if anyone finds out about what he's actually doing, it would just be the end of the world for him. He already deals with so much bullying and embarrassment from his sisters that he just does not want a whole nother thing to get hated on about. The next morning, we get back to Barry's office, and this one I'd like to mention the music in this film. The music pretty much just escalates the anxiety 10 times more than it would without the music. It's just this very fast-paced kind of sound, and it's super intense, and even before everything starts to go down in this scene, you already start to feel really nervous and anxious about what's about to happen. Also, during the scene, he starts to tape up and try to fix the piano, which, again, the piano represents the heart. So he's trying to tape up and repair the heart. After he repairs the piano, his sister walks in, and with this very intense music going on in the background, the first thing she mentions is how stupid his suit is and that she doesn't know why he's wearing the suit. Which kind of shows the anxiety in his head that even something small like wearing a suit, he'll just get hated on for. And in this scene, the sister's dialogue is also in almost this uncanny valley of speech, where she's literally speaking without taking even a breath, asking him to go eat with them. Kind of like the embodiment of these never-ending doubts and anxious thoughts in the brain that just keep flowing. As he's talking to his sister and as he's talking to Lena, he also has the sex worker on the phone that he talked to the night before, trying to basically scam him and threatening that if he like hangs up and doesn't give her more money that she's gonna expose him. And in the background the music becomes this loud just banging of drums that's super intense. And this is overall probably the most intense scene in the whole entire film. I don't want to explain how every single scene with anxiety plays out in the film, because that's what watching the film is for. But I would like to talk about the ending of the film. Basically, throughout the film, Lena, the love interest, is kind of his saving grace. And over time, Barry gets more and more comfortable around Lena. But at the end of the film, the phone sex scammers literally crash into his car when he's with Lena. But because he's been with Lena more and more throughout the movie, it's like he's just overcame this anxiety that he's had the whole film. And he literally starts beating up the bad guys like it's an action movie. It's a literal depiction of fighting anxiety. People overcome anxiety in many different ways, but in this film, Barry overcomes his anxiety through Lena, and just spending more time with her, he builds more confidence in himself. By the end of the film, he is literally face to face with the evil mattress man who is trying to scam him and ruin his life. And he defeats him, and in the last scene of the movie, he grabs his piano and he carries it to Lena, and the piano comes full circle, and he ends the movie playing it for Lena and just showing their love for each other. I don't really have anything else to say about the movie besides I'd recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it, and if you have seen it, I also recommend you watch it because it's amazing. And like and subscribe.